This is part 3 of our 8-part series on the Law and the Covenants. In part 1, we proposed a general theological framework and summarized this into 4 main points, which we will explain throughout this series. In part 2, we reviewed several examples of general laws that God gave to humanity from the time of Adam until the establishment of the Old Covenant. In this lecture, we will examine the Law of Moses and learn about the different roles and responsibilities that people had living in the land of Israel under the Old Covenant. In particular, we are going to concentrate on 2 main points. First, the Mosaic Law contains many stipulations that apply to all humanity. This represents continuity between the Old and New Testament. Second, the Mosaic Law contains some stipulations that only apply to Israel. This represents discontinuity between Israelites and Gentiles. Under the terms of the Old Covenant, Israelites had more responsibilities and more blessings than resident aliens living in the land of Israel. In part 1, we also developed a list of 3 questions to help us determine whether a particular law applied to all humanity or not. In part 2, we saw several examples of general laws that existed prior to the establishment of the Old Covenant. In this lecture, we will pay particular attention to laws that were required for resident aliens living in the land of Israel. To understand this material, we need to remember that a covenant is a social contract that exists between 2 parties. In the ancient Middle East, a covenant included a list of stipulations or obligations that the 2 parties had to obey, as well as a list of benefits that were provided in exchange for this obedience. There were also penalties that had to be paid if one particular party failed to meet these stipulations and breached the contract. When God brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, He established them as His chosen nation. Therefore, the Old Covenant was the constitution of the nation of Israel. According to the terms of the Old Covenant, every Israelite enjoyed the full rights and privileges of citizenship within the nation of Israel. They had more responsibilities and obligations than resident aliens, but they also enjoyed greater blessings and benefits as a result. Gentiles living in the land of Israel were resident aliens. They were not full citizens, so they had fewer rights and fewer blessings as a result. These resident aliens may or may not have been interested in worshiping the God of Israel. They were prospective members of the nation of Israel. They were free to become full citizens or remain as resident aliens while they lived among the Israelites. The government of Israel was a theocracy. The nation was both a church and a state, and the law of Moses defined the roles and responsibilities of the executive, judicial, and religious branches of government. Individual citizens also had duties that they had to perform. In general, men had far more stipulations to obey than women, but everyone had specific obligations within Israelite society. While there was only one law in the land of Israel, different groups of people had different roles and responsibilities. For example, the king of Israel had the right to gather taxes, conduct military campaigns, and render judgment in criminal cases. The priests and the Levites had the responsibility to collect tithes from the people, offer animal sacrifices, and teach the people the law of Moses. Israel was a patriarchal society where each man was entitled to a portion of land as his family inheritance. So the sons of Israel were the landed gentry who served in the king's government and employed servants to work on the family plantation. Every Israelite had certain obligations that he had to obey if he lent money, harvested crops, purchased a slave, or hired an employee. The law of Moses also provided resident aliens with fair labor laws, workmen's compensation benefits, welfare benefits, religious obligations, and laws regulating social justice. In many ways, the law of Moses was centuries ahead of its time in protecting the rights of the poor and caring for the needy in society, which is exactly what we would expect from a loving and merciful Creator. We also need to understand three key Hebrew terms used in the Bible for resident aliens. The first term is ger, entry 1731 in the Dictionary of Biblical Languages, which refers to an alien, a stranger or foreigner, someone who is of a different geographical or cultural group, often with less rights than the reference group. The term ger does not refer to a Gentile proselyte who had already become a citizen of the nation of Israel. A ger was an uncircumcised Gentile who was living among the Israelites. The second term is nakeri, entry 5799, which refers to someone or something foreign or alien, that which is not in the same clan, land area, or religion as the speaker. This is someone who has only a distant or limited association with another person. The final term is toshav, entry 9369, which refers to a temporary resident, a sojourner, or stranger. This is primarily an alien living in an area that is not one's normal country, a class of people with less social rights. However, the term can sometimes refer to a guest, a temporary resident with a family, but still of the same ethnic class. So in this particular case, the meaning of the term depends on a particular context where it appears. Now that we have carefully defined all these terms, we are ready to examine several different topics within the law of Moses that illustrate the different roles and responsibilities that people had within Israelite society. In part 2, we saw that God gradually revealed His laws to humans through a process of progressive revelation. As we cover each of these topics, we will see some similarities with this earlier material, but also some interesting modifications or enhancements to these general laws. The first topic deals with circumcision. The first time that circumcision is mentioned is in Genesis chapter 17, verse 9, where God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male child among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." Although this covenant first appears during the patriarchal era, it is not a general law because it is limited in scope. Circumcision applies only to the male descendants of Abraham, which includes the Ishmaelites, the Israelites, and the Edomites. When God established the Old Covenant within Israel, He reiterated the commandment of circumcision. In Leviticus chapter 12, verse 2, God told Moses to speak to the sons of Israel, saying, "When a woman gives birth and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days, as in the days of her menstruation she shall be unclean. On the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised." Based on what we just read, is this commandment general or not? It is not general. This law specifically applies to the sons of Israel. Resident aliens were not forced to undergo circumcision in order to live in the land. Gentiles could travel freely throughout the land of Israel, conduct business with Israelites, and even worship at the tabernacle without being circumcised. The next topic deals with the Sabbath and God's holy days. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 9, God told the Israelites, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner, the ger, who stays with you. Is this commandment a general law or not? It is general. This commandment applies equally to Israelites and Gentiles. This is consistent with the material that we covered in Part 2 related to the Sabbath. God sanctified the seventh day at creation as a blessing for all mankind, and he reiterated that law here. The next commandment is found in Exodus chapter 12, verse 48, where God told Moses, "If a stranger, a ger, sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised, and then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it." Based on what we just read, is this commandment a general law or not? It is not general. This passage clearly shows that an uncircumcised Gentile was not part of the covenant community and was not allowed to eat the Passover. This passage also shows that the term ger referred to an uncircumcised Gentile. A Gentile proselyte was an equal member of the covenant community, like a native-born Israelite. He was no longer a ger, no longer a resident alien. The next commandment deals with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 19, God told Moses, 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your homes, for whoever eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is an alien, that is, a ger, or a native of the land. Again, is this a general law or not? In this particular case, it is a general law. Resident aliens were required to remove leaven from their homes during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, just like the congregation of Israel. At this point, it should be clear that the law of Moses placed different levels of responsibility on different groups of people living in the land of Israel. The context and scope of a commandment determine whether it is general or not. This distinction will become even more important when we examine the New Covenant. The next commandment deals with the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 10, we read, "Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God, with the tribute of a freewill offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, you and your son and your daughter, your male servant and your female servant, the Levite who is within your gates, the stranger, that is, the ger, and the fatherless and the widow who are among you, at the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide." Again, we see that a resident alien was required to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost and rejoice before the God of Israel at his designated sanctuary. While God did not force resident aliens to become proselytes, he did encourage these prospective members to learn about him and his ways. The next example deals with the Day of Atonement. In Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29, we read, "This shall be a permanent statute for you In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls and not do any work, whether the native or the alien who sojourns among you. The Day of Atonement was the most solemn day of the year because on this day the high priest would offer a sacrifice for the forgiveness of all the sins of the entire nation. The law of Moses required Israelites and resident aliens to fast and observe a solemn Sabbath rest on this day. The last festival of the year in Israel was the Feast of Booths, also known as Sukkot. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 13 we read, "You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths 7 days after you have gathered in your threshing floor and your wine vat, and you shall rejoice in your feast, you and your son and your daughter and your male and female servants, and the Levite and the stranger and the orphan and the widow who are in your towns." The Feast of Booths was a Thanksgiving festival. Everyone was commanded to rejoice before God for providing an abundant harvest, and share their blessings with the poor and needy. Since resident aliens didn't own land, they depended on Israelite farmers for jobs and a place to live, and God made sure that they shared in the bounty that He provided. The law of Moses also included another commandment about the Feast of Booths. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 42, God told Moses, "You shall live in booths. For 7 days all the native-born in Israel shall live in booths, so that your generations may know that I had the sons of Israel live in booths when I brought them out from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." So God required native-born Israelites to live in temporary shelters during the Feast of Booths, to remind them that their forefathers lived in tents when they came out of Egypt. Clearly, this commandment did not apply to resident aliens, but it did teach them about the miraculous power of the God of Israel. There is one more commandment associated with the Feast of Booths that we still need to cover. In Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 10 we read, "Then Moses commanded them, saying, At the end of every 7 years, at the time of the year of remission of debts, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God, at the place which He will choose, you shall read this law in front of all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, the men and the women and children, and the alien who is in your town, so that they may hear and learn and fear the Lord your God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law." So every 7 years, the leaders had to read the entire book of the law to all of the people, native Israelites and resident aliens alike, so that they would learn about God and carefully observe all His laws. Although resident aliens did not have to obey every aspect of the Mosaic law, God still wanted them to learn about His ways and to understand their rights under the law. The next topic concerns tithes and offerings. In Numbers chapter 18, verse 21, God said to Aaron, "To the sons of Levi, behold, I have given all the tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service, which they perform, the service of the tent of meeting. The sons of Israel shall not come near the tent of meeting again, or they will bear sin and die. Only the Levites shall perform the service of the tent of meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations, and among the sons of Israel they shall have no inheritance." In part 2 we saw that Abram gave his tithes to Melchizedek, a priest of God Most High. However, in this passage, God appointed the entire tribe of Levi to be His ministers within the land of Israel, and He gave them all the tithe in Israel as their compensation. As a result, God did not give the Levites large tracts of farmland so they could support themselves. They were allowed to live in the surrounding towns and cities, but they were to earn their living by ministering to the people of Israel. This is not a general law, because it deals specifically with the tribe of Levi and their right to collect the tithe of Israel. But there is an interesting precedent here that we will see again when we study the New Covenant. The conclusion that we can draw here is that tithing is God's basic method of providing for the servants that He calls to the ministry. The next commandment deals with voluntary offerings. In Numbers chapter 15, verse 14, we read, "If an alien, a ger, sojourns with you, or one who may be among you throughout your generations, and he wishes to make an offering by fire as a soothing aroma to the Lord, just as you do, so shall he do." There are several interesting points that we can glean from this passage. First, God didn't hinder Gentiles from worshiping Him. Although resident aliens were not required to offer sacrifices to the God of Israel, they were permitted to bring voluntary offerings just like native-born Israelites. Also, there were no double standards when it came to the worship of the God of Israel. The regulations concerning voluntary offerings applied equally to resident aliens and Israelites alike. They offered the same kind of animals, the same amount of grain, and the same amount of wine with each sacrifice. According to the law, men did not have to be circumcised in order to enter the sanctuary courtyard to present their offerings, but they did have to be ritually clean. Resident aliens had to avoid touching anything unclean, wash their clothes, and bathe before approaching the altar, just like the Israelites. God wanted His people to be physically and spiritually clean before they worshiped Him. The next commandment related to offerings is Leviticus 17, verse 8, where we read, "Then you shall say to them, any man from the house of Israel, or from the aliens who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, and does not bring it to the doorway of the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man also shall be cut off from his people." There are a couple of interesting observations that we can make. Resident aliens were not required to offer sacrifices to the Lord, but if they chose to do so, they had to bring their sacrifices to the Levitical priests at the sanctuary of the Lord. They couldn't just build an altar and offer a sacrifice anywhere in the land, as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had done. This is a modification of an earlier general law. However, Israelites and resident aliens alike had to be ritually clean in order to enter the sanctuary courtyard with their sacrifice. The same rules applied to both groups in that case. The next commandment is found in Numbers chapter 15, verse 28, where we read, "The priest shall make atonement before the Lord for the person who goes astray when he sins unintentionally, making atonement for him that he may be forgiven. You shall have one law for him who does anything unintentionally, for him who is native among the sons of Israel, and for the resident alien who sojourns among them." Once again, a resident alien who voluntarily chose to worship the Lord had to follow the same ceremonial laws and procedures as the native-born Israelites. In the case of an unintentional sin, a resident alien or an Israelite had to offer the exact same sacrifice for atonement. The general conclusion that we can draw from this series of commandments is that God expected everyone to worship Him according to His regulations and specifications. God did not allow people to do their own thing or worship him according to the customs of other religions. God was very particular about the kind of worship that was acceptable to him. The next topic deals with the food laws for ancient Israel. In Leviticus chapter 17 and verse 10 we read, "And any man from the house of Israel, or from the aliens who sojourn among them, who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people." In part 2 we learned that God gave Noah and his sons this commandment against eating blood. Here in the law of Moses, God repeats the same commandment for both Israelites and resident aliens, showing that this is a general law for all mankind. This is another example of continuity from one era to another. The next commandment illustrates the discontinuity that also exists within the law of Moses between Israelites and Gentiles. We need to remember that some resident aliens voluntarily decided to follow Yahweh, while others did not. And God expected his covenant people to abide by a higher standard. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 21, Moses told the Israelites, "You shall not eat anything which dies of itself. You may give it to the alien, the ger, who is in your town, so that he may eat it, or you may sell it to a foreigner, nakeri, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God." At this point in history, the human race had rejected God in the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel. Humanity was stumbling around in spiritual darkness and was not interested in seeking their Creator. The laws that God gave to Israel clearly would have prevented diseases and fostered a long and happy life, but he did not force unbelievers to obey him and reap the blessings. Unfortunately, desperate people sometimes do desperate things in order to stay alive. So, in Leviticus chapter 17, verse 15, we read, "When any person eats an animal which dies or is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or an alien, he shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and remain unclean until evening. Then he will become clean." Even though the Israelites were not permitted to eat an animal that died of natural causes, God gave Israel this general law to explain the consequences of breaking this law. Anyone, Israelite or Gentile, who ate this kind of meat had to bathe and remain ritually unclean until the next day. In addition to the risk of getting sick, the individual could not worship God at his holy sanctuary until he was clean again. Although the penalty was rather mild, God got the point across that he discouraged this kind of behavior. The next topic deals with laws against immorality. The first example is Leviticus chapter 20, verse 2, where we read, "You shall also say to the sons of Israel, any man from the sons of Israel, or from the aliens, sojourning in Israel, who gives any of his offspring to Molech, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones." While God did not force resident aliens to become part of his covenant community, he did not allow anyone to worship another god, such as Molech, in the land of Israel. This general law is consistent with God's earlier instructions to Noah that every murderer shall be put to death, because the worship of Molech involved human sacrifice. It is also an extension of the sixth commandment prohibiting murder. So it is another example of continuity from one dispensation to another, as well as the gradual revelation of the general laws to all mankind. The next commandment is found in Leviticus chapter 24, verse 16, where God said to Moses, "Moreover, the one who blasphemes the name of Yahweh shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him. The alien, as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. This general law is an extension of the third commandment, and another example of the death penalty being imposed for breaking one of the 10 commandments. This also helps us to understand why God wanted the leaders to read the entire law of Moses to all the people. God required Israelites and resident aliens to obey his laws against immorality, and the penalty for violating them was very serious. The next set of commandments deals with sexual immorality. In Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, God told Moses, "You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Also, you shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it, nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these the nations which I am casting out before you have become defiled." Leviticus chapter 18, verse 25, "For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it. So the land has spewed out its inhabitants. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you." This set of general laws is an extension of the 7th commandment against adultery. But the truly interesting aspect of these laws is that God was about to destroy the Canaanites for breaking them. This suggests that God had revealed these laws to humanity long before the time of Moses. This is supported by the fact that God obliterated Sodom and Gomorrah for their widespread sexual perversion as well. Throughout most of recorded history, people have had strong incentives to get married and have large families, because children would support the family business and take care of their parents in their old age. Obviously, God prohibited sexual promiscuity and perversion because it would spread sexually transmitted diseases and threaten the well-being of the community at large. But human beings didn't understand the microscopic organisms that caused these diseases until relatively recent times. The law of Moses was clearly centuries ahead of its time and provided blessings to those who obeyed God. The next topic deals with the civil laws that regulated Israelite society. The first example comes from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 15, where Moses said, "You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen. You shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner, a Nakari, over yourselves, who is not your countryman." This law specifically limited the government of Israel. The goal of this commandment is to prevent a foreign power from gaining control of the people. Ironically, this was one of the reasons that the Jews in the first century didn't accept Herod as their king, because he was an Edomite, a descendant of Esau. Although this is not a general law for all mankind, the underlying principle is sound and has found its way into the laws of other nations. For example, the founding fathers of the United States incorporated this principle into the Constitution in 1787 by precluding a naturalized citizen from becoming president or vice president of the country. The next commandment is found in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 1, where we read, "At the end of every 7 years you shall grant a remission of debts." This is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall release what he has loaned to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor and his brother, because the Lord's remission has been proclaimed. From a foreigner, a Nakari, you may exact it, but your hand shall release whatever of yours is with your brother. Here we see one of the great advantages of being a full citizen in the nation of Israel. Every 7 years, at the Feast of Booths, the Israelites had to cancel any outstanding debts owed by a fellow Israelite, but not those of foreigners or aliens. So if an Israelite borrowed money and fell on hard times so that he could not repay the loan, God gave him a fresh start, an opportunity to get back on his feet. The net effect was to encourage people to be cautious, thrifty, and righteous. Israelites were probably very reluctant to lend any money for a risky business venture or to an untrustworthy individual. It also encouraged resident aliens to become full citizens of Israel and followers of Yahweh. A similar law is found in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 39, where Moses wrote, "If a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave's service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner, a toshav. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers." This commandment prevented Israelites from falling into perpetual chattel slavery. If an Israelite had very large debts, he could pay them off by becoming an indentured servant, essentially a contract worker, for a term of no more than 50 years. At the end of that time, every indentured servant in Israel was automatically released, and any farmland that they had leased out reverted back to their control. By doing this, God taught the people to be responsible for their decisions and their debts, but he also taught them to extend mercy to the poor and needy. This was just one more incentive for resident aliens to become full citizens in the nation of Israel. If that was not enough, the next commandment certainly would have made them think about it. In Leviticus chapter 25, verse 45, Moses also wrote, "Moreover, you may buy the children of the strangers, the toshav, who dwell among you, and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property, and you may take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves, but regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor." Resident aliens did not enjoy the same protections as the native-born Israelites. Resident aliens could become poor and fall into permanent chattel slavery. Even then, the law of Moses provided several different ways for a foreign slave to obtain his freedom, but it was still much harder for him than for a native-born Israelite. The next commandment deals with the problem of manslaughter. In other words, accidental homicide. In Numbers chapter 35, verse 10, God said to Moses, "Speak to the sons of Israel, and say to them, When you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select for yourselves cities to be your cities of refuge, that the manslayer who has killed any person unintentionally may flee there." Verse 15, "These 6 cities shall be for refuge for the sons of Israel, and for the alien, the ger, and for the sojourner, the toshav, among them, that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there." The law of Moses never punished criminals by locking them up in prison cells for years at a time. Only Gentile nations practiced that kind of punishment. If an Israelite committed premeditated murder, he was tried and executed in a relatively short period of time. However, if an individual accidentally killed someone, he was exiled to one of 6 cities where he could rent a room, earn a living, and see his family occasionally until his exile was over. There was no need for a prison. If he left the city of refuge before his exile was over, the victim's family could kill him without any penalty. That was strong incentive to stay put for a few years. This was a general law that applied equally to Israelites and resident aliens. Whatever differences may have existed regarding debts or servitude, when it came to criminal activity, everyone was equal in the eyes of the law of Moses. Life in ancient Israel was very dangerous and often very short. This particular punishment was severe enough to discourage reckless behavior, but not too severe to destroy a person due to an unintentional accident. It also gave the victim's family time to grieve and let go of any desire for vengeance. A very wise combination of justice tempered with mercy. We have seen several examples of laws that favored Israelites over resident aliens. The next law actually turns the tables a bit. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, Moses told the Israelites, "When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the alien, for the orphan, and for the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands." The needy, mentioned in this command, were at a real disadvantage. A resident alien could not have owned land within Israel where he could grow his own food. He had to find work wherever he could in order to support himself. And a widow or an orphan might be able to raise some sheep or goats, but they would not have been able to plow a large field to grow grain. So this particular law required the native-born Israelites to show generosity to the poor and needy within society, even if they were not Israelites. Although this particular command applies specifically to the Israelites, God clearly used Israel to set a general example to all nations about helping the poor and needy among us. Notice also that God didn't just give the needy all the food they wanted. They had to do some work to get it, even if these remnants were left there for them to find. This allowed the poor to maintain a measure of dignity. It also discouraged stealing and begging among those who were healthy enough to work. If you needed food but didn't have any land or money, you could gather the gleanings of a nearby field. The last commandment that we will examine is found in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 12, where Moses wrote, "When you have finished paying all the tithe of your increase in the 3rd year, the year of tithing, then you shall give it to the Levite, to the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow, that they may eat in your towns and be satisfied." Like the previous commandment, God commanded the Israelites to provide assistance for the poor and needy, even if they were resident aliens. However, in this particular case, the Israelites were supposed to take a tenth of their harvest in the 3rd and 6th years and store it within the gates of their cities, where the leaders of the people would distribute it to the needy. So in addition to the gleanings, God established a social security fund to provide for those who could not support themselves. Once again, we see that the law of Moses was centuries ahead of its time in terms of social justice and humanitarian compassion. While this command applied specifically to the Israelites, God clearly used Israel to set a general example to all nations about helping the poor and needy. At this point, we have more than a couple dozen commands within the law of Moses that discuss the rights and obligations of native-born Israelites and resident aliens, and we are now in a position to draw some general conclusions. First, we saw that the law of Moses does indeed contain many stipulations that apply to all humanity. From the time of Adam to the establishment of the Old Covenant at Mount Sinai, we have seen a growing body of general laws that God expected Israelites and Gentiles to obey. This represents not just continuity from one dispensation to the next, but also continuity between the Israelites and Gentiles. Second, we saw that the law of Moses also contains many stipulations that only apply to the native-born Israelites living in the Promised Land under the terms of the Old Covenant. Most of these laws dealt with the unique aspects of Israelite society, such as laws regulating the monarchy, the Levitical priesthood, and the duties of one Israelite to his fellow Israelite. God had one law for the land of Israel, but different people had different roles and responsibilities under that one law code. This represents a fundamental discontinuity between what God expected of Israel and what he required of Gentiles. However, even in those unique situations where the Mosaic law did not apply to resident aliens, God often used Israel to set a positive moral example to the surrounding Gentile nations, a fact that will become increasingly important as we go on. And finally, we saw that even though God did not require resident aliens to become full-fledged citizens and converts to Mosaic Judaism, he did encourage Gentiles to learn about him and required them to obey certain general laws that focused on a few core issues, such as the Sabbath and the holy days, sacrifices and offerings, basic standards of morality and diet. Some of these general laws were simply restated from the book of Genesis. Other laws were expanded and clarified from the patriarchal period, while still others appeared for the very first time in the Mosaic Law Code, yet clearly applied to both Israelites and Gentiles equally. Now that we have concluded our examination of the Mosaic Law, we are ready to begin our study of the New Covenant. In Part 4, we will learn more about these two different covenants that are built on one common foundation.